talented staff that are going to take care of you. They're accredited with the Better Business Bureau. You're in good hands. So dial pound 250, say the keyword Lemon Lawyer, or go to mylemonlawyer.com. This report is sponsored by Mothers Against Drunk Driving.
For victims of drunk and drug driving, our grief is unique. But you are not alone. You always have a place at MAD. Call our 24-hour victim helpline at 877-MAD-HELP or visit mad.org.
What's the best place to reach new customers for your business? Wherever they are. And that's exactly where you can be with iHeartMedia. We talk to our listeners everywhere, from the car to the gym to the kitchen. Next customer is listening. And not only can we get your message to your audience, we can also show you how it's working in real time. That goes for broad brand messaging and targeted hyperlocal influencer campaigns alike. Start growing your business today by calling 844-GET-MY-AD. That's 844-GET-MY-AD. The free iHeartRadio app has over 100 commercial-free stations waiting for you to explore right now. Like the Beatles Now and Then, celebrating all things Beatles. Together, you say goodbye, I say hello. Legendary clips, deep cuts, live performances, and all their solo hits. Just open the free iHeartRadio app and search the Beatles Now and Then and listen now to iHeartRadio. Free never sounded so good. iHeartRadio.
Broadcasting from the confines of an abandoned radio station in the secluded apartment building, no joke of high strangeness, from the foothills of the Colorado Rockies. It is time for full disclosure of the topics they told us were off limits. Hello there, I'm Connie Willis. This is Coast to Coast AM. Tonight, space rocks, telepathy, all sorts of great things that you're going to hear tonight. I'm telling you, you're going to like it. And great party songs to celebrate fall. Why not? So time now to turn off those lights. Join me for another interesting evening of conversation, much needed education, and the chance that we might get a little closer to the truth of what lurks amongst us and what is beyond. I'm Connie Willis, and this is Coast to Coast AM.
I want to talk to you about rising crime and personal attacks in our cities. Law enforcement simply can't get there in time to stop an attack, so who's going to protect you and your family? My friends at Hero2020.com are in the business of saving lives. Hero 2020 is my number one choice for non-lethal self-defense. It's a powerful pepper gun with interchangeable cartridges that's easy to load and reload, even if you're not familiar with firearms. Inside is a military-grade pepper irritant that stops and disables attackers. One of my favorite things about Hero 2020 is how small and compact it is. I can comfortably carry it concealed everywhere I go, and while there are a few restrictions, it's actually legal in all 50 states. It's no wonder Hero 2020's patented design has won 2 national awards and is trusted by over 10,000 families in America. If you want to protect yourself, your home, your family, choose Hero 2020. Get 10% off with my code George. Order today at Hero2020.com.
Real people, real stories.
I have bruising that's all over my arms. 3 weeks after I was on the carnivore, I noticed, I'm looking at my arms, and I said, gee, I don't have any bruises on my arms, and I'm always full of bruises. I can't put my finger on it, but I know something's happening. I have to tell you, that has to be a carnivore.
I've got a Labrador. She can hardly lift herself up off the floor. I won't tell you what the veterinarian said. The treatment was there, and I said, no way. That's when I said, you know what, this could be the ticket. So I started administering it, and she took to it right away. In 3 weeks, you could tell she was very alert. 6 weeks into the protocol, she seemed like she was 100%. She was going on 5-mile walks. I'm like, right. She is just like prime again.
Call 866-836-8735. That's 866-836-8735. Or visit carnivore.com. That's carnivora.com.
KFI AM 640, more stimulating talk.
You are listening to Coast AM. Hello there, Connie Willis on a Saturday night. I hope you're having a good night, and I hope that tonight helps it even better with the great guests that we have to educate and to teach you some things. You'll be able to call in as well and ask some questions too. Thank you so much for all the letters since the last time I've talked to you. Great emails. Thank you so much. There's always the haters, yes, but there's so many more of you that are kind and giving, and I appreciate that. Not just direct messaging me that way, but also doing it on more and more on the social media. That's fine. Don't be afraid. Please do that. I like it. It's very nice, and I just want you to know that I appreciate it. I don't always get to it because there's so much out there. I don't know how people do it. I need to be a 6-year-old little kid, and then I could conquer it all. But I do my best. And, because the other part of my life is putting together my shows. I call it now the Connie Willis Network because underneath it is Blue Rock Talk, which is Earth's most interesting conversations. That's people, places, and things. And we talk about all these really incredible things that we talk about here on Coast to Coast. And it's not the 101, is it true, is it not, is it true, yes it is, no it isn't. It's not that fight. You get nowhere that way. It's already believing, already knowing, already seen it. And we go down into the deep roots and we compare them and talk about the similarities, or we just talk. Actually, it's become more of just the Blue Rocker community where we kind of just talk. And, if you decide to join, you're going to be a part of that community for a long time. So now I just moved it over to X from TikTok because we can say what we want and nobody cuts us off. Do you know how many times I keep getting cut off? Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, cutting me off, punishing me because I'm talking about Bigfoot, ETs, UFOs, or some psychic has predicted something. So X is where we are, freedom of speech. That's where it's safe. That's where I am. So go find me, Connie Willis X, actually, on X, and that's where the subscription is now. You too can become a Blue Rocker and be a part of it. It's only $7 a month. I have taken it down from $49.50 a month to $7. Okay, so I hope that everybody can take advantage of that, and I really hope that you do. And we'll have, it'll be fun. You'll learn more about Project Creepy Hotspots when we go on expeditions, live investigations, Bigfoot, ETs, strange lights, all these types of things, hauntings, a lot of fun, real deep dives into the real. So if for some reason
I'm
you
listening
don't
to Coast to Coast.
to go to Twitter,
I'm watching Joe
Connie
Rogan.
Willis X. Also on TikTok, by the way, just not with the. And I'll still be on Facebook and YouTube and all that. Please find me at all those places. But go to ConnieWillis.com. That's where you can find everything. And also, while you're there, it's going to pop up. My newsletter's called
What is that?
Willis. I always try to say it like George. And still got to get it on. And it would be great to have that played every time. I think that would be great. Anyway, I hope that you do sign up and at least sign up for my email newsletter. But I hope you also find me on
Well,
Twitter.
that is convenient.
Coming up soon, I'm going to start my own chocolates. I can't wait. They're going to be creepy collectibles. I'll tell you when it happens. I'm really excited about that. So hang in there for that. Everybody loves chocolate. I can't believe how much everybody likes chocolate. Come on. I love it. I'm happy about that because I'm going to have Connie's Chocolates is going to start, and I'm going to have creepy collectibles. So that'll be really, really cool. And I think it's going to be fun. So I'll let you know when that happens. But just go to ConnieWillis.com. That's where you're going to learn all this type of stuff. Before the next time I come on, which is going to be October 19th. By the way, the next time I'm on, October 19th, I'll be celebrating 10 years with Coast to Coast. I can't believe it. 10 years. George Norrie said, go ahead, Connie, take the reins for these certain nights. I'm very happy about that. Thank you, George. Appreciate that. Year.
You're right. I think when George Norrie retires, this lady takes over. You watch.
But my birthday's on American now and did. But don't forget, it's also. So I got there. I got all sorts of stuff. Go find me. .com. Say condolences. Victims. Coast listeners. I want to thank the people who helped me. Thanks so much. And I want videos. Please don't. We have enough problem, right? Properly.
I gotcha. I think he was put in a bad position. He's got to be like Aaron Rodgers taking over after Brett Favre. It's like, how are you gonna do that? Or right. So I think he, like, everybody hates him. They call him George Snorri. Well, George Knapp is the best. It's the last Sunday, the last 2 Sundays of every month. George Knapp, in my opinion, is even better than Art Bell. It goes to me. George Knapp is number 1. Art Bell is 2. And then there are a bunch of guys in there. They had some guys who I liked that they got rid of. I like John B. Wells. I thought he did a pretty good job. But they got rid of him. I mean, like, I was
part of the professional. I
understand.
Constantly on meteorites.
There's Ian Punnett. He died. Fuck Ian Punnett. Yeah, but fuck him. You know why? Dude, no, fuck him. You know why? Because one time I called in trying to get some momentum going for the world's most retweeted thing for world peace, and he said that was a good idea and that he would retweet it, and he didn't. So fuck him. Aside from that, he was fine, and he actually grew on me. I didn't dislike him at all. He's fine. I understand. But yeah. So I spoke with him. I've spoken with him. I've spoken with like 3 of their hosts. Him, Richard Syrett, and Ian Punnett, Richard Syrett, and somebody else. I don't think I've ever spoken with Connie Willis or George Norrie. Because just hasn't worked out. And I've spoken with somebody else they have. But I don't know who it was. I don't remember. Anyway. George Norrie has like over a year of vacation time that he's never taken. So like when he retires, he'll be able to like get paid for a whole extra year. Well, the thing is, nobody wants him to take any time off because the fan base is so fucking loyal. They're like, if he takes off a week, people would be like, oh, get this guy out of here. I have, you know what? For as much shit as people give George Norrie, to my knowledge, and I could be wrong, but I think I'm basically the biggest fucking Coast to Coast fan out there, aside from like Cornelius in Louisiana, with whom I've spoken. If you want to know people who think I'm that guy, it's fucking Cornelius from fucking Louisiana, because he got all scared when a rabbi called him to tell him. What was up? He got so scared. Poor fucking Cornelius. Man, Cornelius is in all kinds of trouble. I don't know. I feel sorry for Cornelius. It's really sad. Anyway, oh, Cornelius. So like I'm like a legend. Or I've talked to like a legend, like the legends of fucking Coast to Coast. And yeah, and what? Um
How many languages do you speak?
what have I talked about there? I talked about
Okay, good.
trying to get
How many languages do
a
you
bunch of
speak?
people to retweet my fucking tweet. That didn't work. I tried. I shouldn't say it didn't work. I actually got some people randomly like who retweeted it, and I asked them, "How'd you find out about me?" And at least one of them I know. He was one of the first people who ever followed me. He said, "I asked him, did you happen to hear me on like a radio talk show?" And he's like, "Yeah, it was something like that." I was like, "Okay, cool." And then what else? What else? I talked about the Galactic Federation in another with Richard Serrett. And then,
do you just bounce around?
I think I've spoken to Richard Serrett twice. Yeah, I have. So this one guy, Richard Serrett, he's always like, no politics and no COVID talk. And the time I called in, I talked about both. And well, what did I talk about? I gave him a breakdown of who I thought the upcoming like 6 presidents would be, and then COVID. I said that there'd be another one, and that they would be named for like the year. Like that's not like groundbreaking, but so like one in 19 or 1 in 20 was for the year 19. So there might be like a COVID 24 or COVID 25. I think that might have been Mpox. I don't know. Who the fuck knows? It could fucking grow. And then what else did I say? I said something about we talked about life extension technology a little bit and mind uploading technology and stem cells and human growth hormone. I mean, I didn't have a lot of time to talk, but and then I gave myself a shout out and I said, and at the end I was like, and follow at Rabbi Rothschild on Twitter. I think I did that on all of them. I'm fucking really good at that, plugging myself. Heyo. So you can tell, like, I have a fucking long history with this Twitter account, and for them to take it away, I'm like, you punks. I'm just gonna do what I can to fucking annoy them. At least overnight, I feel it can't hurt to just fill their fucking inbox. It's like, what's the worst that can happen?
I have to say, I would say, for example, the images I have from the article, so even I'm more than 50 years old. So it stays in our mind and it's how it is that the way we are strong and things like that for everybody. Mm-hmm. So the first 5 years it was really dead for me because I was the completely. I don't go home, so I stay home. And the funny thing about it, this is the first time I will talk about it on the radio anyway, because it's just between the family. But I will give you the honor today to talk about it.
Thank you.
People change the conversation, so let's talk.
All right.
So, and then between that 5 years in the hospital, I ended up passing away when I was 2.5, declared completely dead. And then it was funny, a lot of people will navigate things like that. But my grandma was with me in the hospital because my mom was taking care of all the brother and sister I had. So I was staying almost for 5 years with my grandma. Oh, that woman is a strong woman who loves God and she never missed a church, for example, speak on that. So I passed away when I was 2, declared dead, and they called my mom to come take your
your son is dead. And my grandma didn't believe on that. So he went across the office of the church, he grabbed the priest. He bring the priest in and he said, my grandson is not dead. Because God told me he will be a good man. And the priest, you know, when it happens, things like that, you say, oh, that woman is suffering, he just lost her grandson. So he did pray a prayer like to bless the body. My grandma said, no, I didn't ask you to bless the body. I'm telling you to pray for him. He's not dead. So, and from there, she cried and then screamed, my grandson moved. People look at her and say, this woman is really losing it. But the nurse who lost me so much because, you know, I grew up in that 5 years with nurses. So I was a little bit advanced for a kid between 1 and 5 because I was living in the professional place where nurses and doctors.
Nothing but adults. Yeah.
Yeah, so around there. But that nurse who loved me so much was even crying, and it looked where I was laying, she saw me moving my left hand after the right one. And she said, it's the right for the right part. My mom was already on the way to do all the things. And when she came there the next day, because it's 350 kilometers, so driving, and the road are not so nice here, so it takes a long time. And when she got there the next day, she saw me under the tree running around. She said, what's up? And it's why with my language, they were calling me when I was a kid, most of the time, Akufa Alamika. Akufa means Alamika, it means just the one who died and came back to life.
Oh, wow.
And, that name I didn't like it so much.
No.
We didn't speak this thing. So from there, I traveled. There was a story. Since post radio is open to things that is strange.
Yes.
And the first time under that tree or where my mom found me, running with just the underwear and no shirt on me, just turning around the tree.
And alive.
Yeah, alive.
Alive.
The next day, when I was 6 years dead, completely dead.
Oh, it was the next day. Oh.
For centuries, long before the Opium Wars, Europeans have been making their way over to China. There were, of course, some travelers like Marco Polo, which I'm sure you are aware of, but even before him, there were the Radhanites. These were Jewish merchants who traveled the length of the Silk Road, setting off from Europe, sailing to Egypt, crossing overland to the Red Sea, and onwards to China. And, in fact, there was a Jewish community living in Kaifeng until the 17th century. Christianity also made its way over to China in the Dark Ages, and their church, the Nestorian Church, was one of the first to split from Rome. However, trapped behind Islamic empires, it began to fade away. And one other notable case of early exploration of China came in the 6th century, when Byzantine monks looking to end the Chinese monopoly of silk traveled to China to steal silkworm eggs. But throughout medieval times, it was largely the Muslims who dominated trade between East and West, and there were large populations of Persians and Arabs living within China. So large, in fact, that in the 9th century they began to be blamed for the country's ills, and the Chinese massacred them. Numbers are disputed, but it was probably over 100,000 Muslims that were killed in Guangzhou in 878. Then the Mongols invaded China and welcomed the traders back. But once again, tensions boiled over, and they were massacred again after the Isba Rebellion in 1357. So the outside world was very aware of China, and China was well aware of the outside world. Then by the 15th century, the Mongols had been driven back up north, and the Ming dynasty ruled China, and they were initially open to the idea of international exploration. Notably, they sent John He on a voyage across East Africa, Asia, and Arabia. But China didn't trade in the same way as the Europeans. They relied on the tributary system, where the smaller countries would hand over tributes as a gift almost. This not only brought the smaller powers peace, but helped create the idea of Sinocentrism, the belief that China was the center of the world. And it wasn't just the Chinese who bought into this. The Koreans did especially, and so too did the Japanese and Vietnamese to a lesser extent. This idea of Sinocentrism wasn't just cultural, but rather quite literate at times. Wei Jun had, for instance, complained about European maps, saying, Matteo Ricci puts China not in the center. This is altogether far from the truth, for China should be in the center of the world, which can be proved by the simple fact we can see the North Star resting at the zenith of the heaven at midnight. But throughout China's long history, the tributary system included hundreds of states across Southeast Asia, the steppes of Central Asia, and beyond. This worked well for the Chinese as they produced enough food to feed their population, and most of the luxury goods that the world wanted, like porcelain, silk, and tea. Plus, by avoiding open international trade, this tributary system allowed the government to keep control of prices within their empire. So Zhong He was not so much looking for trading routes, but rather collecting tributes. Then in the 16th century, the Portuguese discovered Arabia, and diplomatic relations were finally opened up, but not for them. This is partly because piracy was a problem for the Ming, specifically Japanese pirates known as the Ming. So the Ming began to close their country to international trade to protect against this new threat. Plus, the Portuguese began to enslave Chinese, and they were only driven back at the Battle of Shan Cao Wan in 1522. Yet this just encouraged the Europeans to join the Japanese in launching pirate raids. Elsewhere, some Europeans, especially the Spanish, made detailed plans on conquering China from their base in the Philippines. They expected an army of just over 20,000 Spaniards, Japanese, and Filipinos would do the job. And although this may seem like a ludicrous plan, we said that the Ming dynasty was far from strong. Massacred half of Chinese troops. This able to deal with threats from the sea, the fear of Mongol attacks, and rebuild sections of the Great Wall. As in 1550, the Mongols crossed the Great Wall and sacked Beijing. The Ming could barely muster together an army of 50,000 men to drive them back, so the Ming were weakened. They were besieged. As they built the wall in the north, they also enforced a sea ban to try and prevent any threats from the sea. This stopped anyone from landing in or sailing from China, essentially closing the country off. Yet, as the Portuguese agreed to help crush the pirates, they were given Macau and allowed to trade there. Further threats to China would come from Japan, who had just unified under Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and he, in the 1590s, looked to invade Korea and march right onto China. But thankfully for the Chinese, the Korean Navy defeated the Japanese and ended the Imjin War, preventing a Japanese invasion of China. But this didn't give them peace for very long, as around the same time, the Jurchens in the north began to unite under Nurachi, and he began launching invasions of northern China and even Korea. The Jurchens, who were later known as the Manchus, were considered barbarians by the Chinese and Koreans. So the Koreans initially refused to pay tribute to them, but this just resulted in another invasion in 1636, and this tribute continued for centuries. Yet in Korea, they would develop the idea of Sojong-War, or Little China, believing that they were the last bastion of civilization after the Ming dynasty fell to the barbarians. Meanwhile, as the Jurchens were pushing south, peasants in China, led by Li Zecheng, sacked Beijing in 1644. The last Ming emperor committed suicide, and Li became the first and only emperor of the Shun dynasty. And a little interesting fact for you, when trying to stop the peasant forces, the Ming dynasty deliberately flooded the Yellow River and destroyed the town of Taipei. And this is believed to have ended the Jewish community in China, as no real traces exist of them afterwards. Ming generals, angry with the peasant takeover, threw open the gates of the Great Wall, and the Jurchens, while they all the Manchus from here on out, swept south and captured Beijing the following year. The Qing dynasty under the Sun Qi emperor had thus come to power in China, and as the Ming had already been defeated, this made their path to claim the right to rule or the mandate of heaven far easier. But they were still outsiders in this country. In some regards, their outsider status helped them out, as they gained favour with the Tibetans and Mongols. Plus, their imperial examinations provided opportunities for people from all ethnicities to climb the social ladder. However, there were, of course, still ethnic tensions between the Manchus and the majority Han population. For instance, they required all Han Chinese to adopt their hairstyle with queue, which was met with resistance. But the Qing dynasty responded brutally to dissent and often massacred whole towns, like in Jiangyin. Plus, the Manchus also built a willow palisade around Manchuria in order to prevent Han Chinese from moving into the region. The Manchus also brought their military organization into China, and this was previously created by Rothschild when he united the Manchus. And to summarize them, every household was sworn to a company, and every company was sworn to a different colored banner. By 1614, there were just 4, yellow, white, red, and blue. But as Naruchi began uniting the tribes and invading parts of China, more banners were added by just adding a border around the outside of them. These were the banner armies, and the yellow banner, which Naruchi personally led, was the basis of the flag of the Qing dynasty. Further banner armies were created for the Mongols and the Chinese, so in total there were 24, and initially the emperor just controlled a few of them, but over time they were all brought under the emperor's direct control to perform coups and challenges to the throne. But the banner system wasn't so important for the military as it affected most aspects of life, and bannermen would often live strangely separated from the rest of the population. This is because the bannermen were essentially nobility and received annual pensions and land from the government. Ethnicity in the banner system was a bit complex. For instance, some Han bannermen adopted Manchu names before the invasion of Beijing, but afterwards many Manchu bannermen became more Chinese. Marriage rules between Han and Manchu depended on whether they were in a banner or not, and sometimes Manchu bannermen adopted Han children into their households, creating a further complication as to who belonged where. Plus, importantly, the Manchus lacked numbers, so sometimes Han families were just brought up to the rank of Manchu, given Manchu names, and took up the position of a Manchu. It was all pretty complicated. Yet in the 17th century, this banner system was initially very successful, and they held the highest ranks within the military. Under them was the Green Standard Army. This was a far larger army working more like a police force than an army in war, and it was mainly made up of Han Chinese. And on this, I think I should take a little time just to explain the ethnic of China. Obviously, you have the Manchus, Hans, and Tibetans, which I've already mentioned. But in southern China, you also had groups that speak languages in the Miao family group. These were groups like the Miao, the Hmong, and Liao. Also in the south, you had the Cantonese, who would later fight against the Han. Then there's the Zhuang, who lived in Guangxi province, and the Wu people who lived around Sichuan. And it should be said that the regions that lived and changed drastically over time. Most of these people moved further south in the 19th and 20th centuries, and to avoid persecution, many of them left the country to Southeast Asia and even beyond. In the west of China, there's Turkic groups like the Uyghurs, who are Muslim, but at this time they were more often called Turanchi. And there's also a group of Chinese Muslims known as the Hui, and they went by many names like the Dungan or sometimes the Panthai. So sometimes it's a bit confusing when looking at Hui rebellions, because the names of them often change. And bear all of these groups in mind for the 19th century, as they would all rise at different points. But these are just some of the many ethnic groups within China. Many of them are just branches of a larger ethnic group. For instance, there are the Tanka people, who traditionally live on boats around the southern coast, and they were and still are seen as social outcasts, and can be compared to the trapping community in Europe. Anyway, it was the Green Standard Army which, although was Han, was instrumental in putting down the early Ming loyalist revolts. The first major uprising was the revolt of the Three Feudatories. This was caused when the emperor decided to take back provinces he had rewarded to Han generals who defected from the Ming and joined in the invasion. The Green Standard Army proved effective at crushing the rebels, but Ming loyalists elsewhere got involved and formed a base in Taiwan. This, by the way, is something you can draw a later parallel with later on in the 20th century, like when the nationalists fled to Taiwan to escape communist rule. So here you had Ming loyalists escaping to Taiwan to escape Qing rule. But Taiwan at that time was predominantly Austronesian, not really Chinese at all. And before this, the first major nation to settle there were the Dutch, who arrived in the early 1620s. So the Ming loyalists had to drive the Dutch out. However, unlike the nationalists later on, the Ming loyalists did not find security on the island, as the Qing dynasty sailed to Taiwan to mop up the rebellion, thus bringing Taiwan into their empire. Then the Sun Chi Emperor died in 1661 and was replaced by the Kang Chi Emperor. And under his 61-year rule, the Qing dynasty experienced a great deal of growth. They drove back Russian incursions in the north and brought Mongolia into their empire. They continued to fight with the Jungas in the west for many decades. But when the Jungas invaded Tibet, the Chinese also invaded Tibet, thus turning it into a protectorate and later bringing it into their empire. However, the Qing dynasty not only maintained the isolationist policy of the Ming, but stepped it up a gear out of fear of Ming loyalists. This is because the Ming had been pushed further south and off the mainland, so the Qing banned anyone from living on coastal areas in certain provinces. So for a couple of decades, nobody could live within around 25 kilometers of the coast, and this, the Great Clearance, of course restricted international trade and smuggling, while also turning some former trading hubs into wastelands. But the Europeans were allowed in China. They were, after all, present in the imperial court, running the observatory and helping provide artillery for the campaigns. In exchange, they were allowed to practice Christianity in China and lead their missions, while over in Japan they had already been banned. But this all changed in the early 18th century because Pope Clement XI refused to allow Chinese Christians to continue practicing Confucian rites. So the Kangxi Emperor, while saying that the Westerners were petty, responded by banning Europeans from preaching in China. This essentially closed China for good, but their quest for further expansion was not over. Kangxi's successor, the Yongzheng Emperor, continued the wars against the Jungas in the west, but these proved incredibly costly, and by the end of his reign in 1735, half of the treasury had been spent on the military. The Yongzheng Emperor, by the way, could be described as an early cosplayer, dressing up as the Dalai Lama, the European fighting tiger, and a host of other things. His successor, the Qianlong Emperor, ruled from 1735 until 1796. He finally crushed the Kosher Mongols and then launched the 10 campaigns, the first of which finally conquered the Jungas, and this ended with a genocide which often goes unmentioned. For during the pacification of the region, around 450,000 people, or around 80% of the population, was eliminated. Otherwise, Napoleon attacked Tibet and forced the Tibetans to pay tribute. So the Chinese counterattacked and forced Nepal to once again pay tribute to the Qing Empire. So in these two examples, the Qing were successful, but their military prowess was tested elsewhere. For instance, their numerous attempts to take Burma were driven back. So too was their invasion of Vietnam, and the remaining campaigns were largely fought against rebels, showing that long before the humiliation of the 19th century, China was facing enormous problems. Some of these were ethnic tensions like the Miao Rebellion of 1735, which centered around Guizhou, and the Tibetan Revolt of 1750. There were also religious uprisings during this time, notably Sufi sects in Xinjiang and Gansu, and these Muslim revolts would often brew up until the 20th century. Plus, there were secret societies which were a powerful force in China for centuries. For instance, there was the Tiandi Hui, which formed in Fujian but moved around the country gaining supporters and occasionally robbing people to fund their revolutionary activities. While they, in the 1780s, rose up in Taiwan under Li Shuangwen. This rebellion included pro-Ming loyalists and people just angry at the Manchurian corruption and rule, and they were able to field an army of around 50,000 people while declaring Lin the new king. But the troops in Beijing were able to crush them with just a couple of years. Yet a lot of the activities and origins of these secret societies remain a mystery. Like the Shaolin monks may have participated in some of them after the Qing dynasty closed down their monasteries due to their pro-Ming allegiances. This, it is said, led to 5 elders traveling around the country and spreading their martial arts. Which aspects of the stories are true, exaggerated, or just completely false is hard to tell. But martial arts would, without doubt, be important in the anti-Qing and anti-foreign movements in the 19th century. Another group which had mysterious origins was the White Lotus Society. These allegedly formed under the Mongol dynasty and led the Red Turban Rebellion, which ushered in the dynasty. How they survived during the Ming Dynasty until the late 18th century, it's hard to say. But in the 1770s, Wang Lung, a martial artist, began teaching people in Shandong. He taught them how to fast for long periods of time, how to meditate, and about the coming of Maitreya. This is, to simplify, a Buddha who would come to earth and achieve complete enlightenment. Maitreya, in this case, can probably be best compared to the second coming of Christ, because just as in Europe, especially in the 17th century, many took up arms to usher in the New World, the same is happening in China. Belief in the coming of a new world is called millenarianism, and was a recurring problem for the Qing dynasty. A much larger rebellion in the 1790s, mountains of Sichuan, Hebei, and Shaanxi. This time, the rebels fought a guerrilla campaign and drove back numerous Qing attempts to restore their authority. Eventually, it was suppressed thanks to the use of local militias, but the rebellion lasted for years. The struggle fighting against a guerrilla force led to widespread atrocities against civilians, and government control was forever weakened in these regions. Plus, although the Qing reached its greatest extent under the Changlong Emperor, its 10 great campaigns were incredibly costly, somewhere in the ballpark of 120 million taels, whereas the annual revenue was only about 40 million. Plus, during his reign, it was already apparent that the banner armies had become redundant and just a curse on the state, as all their expenses still had to be covered. In theory, the government would get their support during a war in exchange, but over time the bannermen had become a little bit decadent and squandered their money on luxuries. Think of them like the Janissaries in the Ottoman Empire, a once proud fighting force that had become militarily useless, but politically strong. Even the Green Standard Army proved to be just a means of income for the commanders and soldiers. As during Wang Lung's rebellion, many of the soldiers could not even fire their weapons. So the Changlong Emperor tried to bring back the old martial ways of the Manchu by reinstating royal hunts, but this was already centuries out of date. What's more, the Solon people in the north on the borders of Russia were apparently starting to use guns while hunting. However, the Changlong Emperor was angered by this and forced them to return to their old ways with bow and arrow. So the few people who were continuing to fight and even modernizing their methods were prevented from doing so. Otherwise, the sea ban and costs of subduing rebellions had left their fleets, which largely just guarded the coasts, incredibly underfunded and neglected. And to further worsen the situation, corruption was rife, and there's no better way to illustrate this than talking about He Shen. He gained favor with the emperor and essentially could act with complete freedom. As such, in the late 18th century, he and his followers looked to artificially extend military campaigns to continue receiving money which they took for themselves. By stealing public money and raising taxes, which he also took, he amassed a fortune equivalent of just under 300 billion in today's money, or around 15 years' income for the state. He was later executed by the Jia Qing emperor, but his rampant corruption diverted a great deal of wealth from the government, meaning the canals running trade through the heart of China went unmaintained, and the Yellow River flood defenses were never repaired. This, of course, would have disastrous consequences again in the 19th century, but more than that, the culture of corruption led to rebellions, incredible waste, lack of modernization, and, later on, opium arriving in the country. But on the Europeans, they were still only allowed to trade in Canton, modern-day Guangzhou, and to a lesser extent Xiamen. But extortion in the region was commonplace, so James Flint with the East India Company decided to sail north to Tianjin to petition the emperor to open other ports. This was highly illegal, and Flint was quickly captured and brought south to Canton, and the Chinese people accused of helping him write the petition were publicly executed for aiding the barbarians. So trade in Xiamen was restricted, and the Canton system for trade was put in place. This meant all international trade in Canton had to be done through the 13 trading companies, known as the Kokong. Of course, the East India Company found this too restrictive for their growing trade, so persuaded the British to send an embassy to meet with the emperor. This, the McCartney expedition of 1793, was ultimately unsuccessful, as the Chinese still had no real reason to trade with the Westerners and still feared Christianity. As the emperor wrote to King George, Our celestial empire possesses all things in prolific abundance and lacks no product within its borders. There is therefore no need to import the manufactures of outside barbarians in exchange for our own produce. So the opportunity to modernize from a position of strength was rejected, and when the Jia Qing Emperor took over in 1796, there were more Miao rebellions and the continuing White Lotus Rebellion to deal with. These were crushed, but there were yet even more White Lotus rebellions in 1813, when Lin Qing led his branch around Shandong in revolt. Now he was probably inspired by a comet spotted in the sky, and believing this to be an omen, rose up to prepare for the end of the world. But there was another recurring problem in China throughout the 19th century, and that is famines. It is said that over the past 2,000 years, 1,800 famines have been recorded in China. However, I find it quite hard to verify this number. But preceding the White Lotus Rebellion, there were two significant ones, in 1810 and 1811. And although a lot of people died, these would be minor compared to famines in later decades which would kill millions. So the rebels gained followers in the midst of these omens and famines, and very nearly succeeded. Their troops marched straight onto the Forbidden City and entered the gates, and they only retreated when the future Daoguang Emperor helped lead the defense by firing muskets at the crowd. With all these internal problems, China was losing its international clout. Fewer and fewer nations were sending tributes, and some of the old states in their tributary system were falling under the influence of Europeans. For instance, at the beginning of the 19th century, the British invaded Nepal, bringing yet another nation further out of their sphere. Furthermore, during all of this, there was a rapid population increase. This happened because compared to previous centuries, there was relative peace, and the importation of crops like potatoes created the right conditions for the population to climb from 100 million to 300 million throughout the 18th century. But the government responded poorly to this population increase, and many people were left hungry. So many Han Chinese began to cross the Willow Palisade in the north and into Manchuria, the only place with free land available to farm. So the rebellions continued. When the Daoguang Emperor took over in the 1820s, Muslims in the west took Yarkand, Khotan, and the likes. And the only reason this rebellion subsided is because their leader was betrayed and imprisoned. And these successive rebellions had depleted treasuries once again. To raise money, the Qing imposed heavy taxes, especially on merchants. So the Kokong merchants in Guangzhou, seeing their income slash, were more open to dealing with foreign merchants, and one money maker for them was opium. Now, opium had always been in China, however, as it only arrived via the tribute system, it was always a luxury for the rich. The East India Company, however, ended that. Looking to end their trading deficit with China, they began growing opium in India and selling it to the Chinese. In 1730, they sold around 1,000 crates a year to the Chinese, but by the 1770s, they were selling over 4,000 crates. Various emperors tried to ban the sale of opium, but the Kokong were willing to ignore this. They met the British merchants at sea, brought opium back to the mainland, and sold it across the country. So by the 1820s and 30s, over 30,000 crates were arriving in China annually, and finally, the East India Company had reversed the deficit. It wasn't just opium that began arriving in the south, however. It was also Christianity. Early missionaries like Robert Morrison translated the Bible into Chinese and converted a very small number of locals. Although this Christian community wouldn't really have an impact for decades, successive emperors issued edicts against the practice of the religion. But back to opium. The emperor sent Lin Zexu to end the opium trade, and he began seizing stockpiles and destroying them in 1839. Many British people did not particularly defend the sale of opium, and in Parliament many spoke against the trade. But the British had recently underwent a great shift in mindset when it came to international trade, spurred on by the writings of Adam Smith and political events like the repeal of the Corn Laws. Britain wanted to trade freely around the world. So the destruction of opium and following skirmishes persuaded the British to get involved, and the First Opium War broke out. On paper, China could have fielded around 800,000 men, with around 200,000 of them carrying some form of firearm. But more often than not, governors had taken money to train and equip an army on paper, but in reality this didn't occur, and they took the money for themselves. So it was probably more likely they had around 100,000 men ready to fight. The few soldiers they did actually have was far from battle ready, and it would take months for them to mobilize from the far-flung reaches of the empire. and be deployed to the battlefield. The British, on the other hand, fielded around 5,000 soldiers and around 7,000 marines and sailors. In theory, this would still make them fiercely outmanned, but if you look at various battles fought, the odds weren't stacked so much against them. For instance, at Chin Hai, a couple thousand veteran British soldiers, backed up with Royal Navy cannon fire, defeated around 8,000 Chinese. So they were still outnumbered, but not as much as what you'd expect. The Chinese also placed command of their troops in the hands of some pretty inept generals. They were, of course, given their titles because of their bloodlines, not skill. But more than that, China hadn't really fought an international war in decades, and of course, never a modern war. So they just didn't have the experience. There was also a fear that if they failed, they would be put to death. And this resulted in a more cautious approach to war. Often various leaders would refuse to fight or aid their fellow leaders elsewhere, as it was far safer to keep to yourself and preserve your life. A lot of them, however, were a bit cowardly and a bit corrupt. Take the example of Yi Shan. He was tasked with fighting the British in Guangdong, but he just trusted the local Cantonese people. Instead, he recruited soldiers from Fujian and beyond, further delaying any real action he could take, and in the meantime he just spent his days dining and partying with other officers. He tried to launch a sneak attack on the British in Guangzhou in May 1841, but when this failed he retreated back into the city and refused to fight them from there on out. He would, however, still send reports to the emperor that all was going well, and the British could easily be defeated. While inside the city, the poor logistics in the army resulted in militias fighting over supplies, and he surrendered to the British shortly afterwards, signing the Treaty of Guangzhou that same month. And he wasn't the only general who made peace with the British without authorization from the emperor. Qi Shan, for instance, had done the same back in January that year. To put this in some form of context, imagine if during World War II, British generals in Africa made peace with the Germans, handing Egypt over to them without informing Churchill. Or on D-Day, just 1/10 of the promised men had actually turned up to fight. Some of the generals refused to take part, supplies were fought over on a first-come, first-served basis, and after the first casualties, they made peace with the Germans again. It would, of course, have been a nightmare to actually win that war, and it was the same for the Chinese. What's more, inside the court there was a feeling of almost indestructibility. They, after all, still saw China as the center of the world, and they looked at the British as rebels, not seeing them as a foreign power. For instance, Lin Zexu wrote in his diary, "I hear that the English rebel ships have already forced their way to the fort at Liaote." And, of course, most importantly, the British Navy was far better equipped than anything that Qing could throw at them. The Chinese had, after all, spent little on their navy after dealing with so many rebellions, and instead relied on their coastal forts to defend them. Plus, what will again be a problem throughout the 19th century, their navy was divided by region. There were a few in total, like at Fujian and Guangdong. This meant they were not only underfunded, but also uncoordinated, and once again many leaders would seek to preserve their own fleet rather than help the other fleets. So the British had an easy job concentrating their force and picking off small navies and attacking relatively undermanned forts and defences. After fighting in Guangdong, they captured coastal forts like Ningbo and even sailed up the Yangtze River to cut trade along the Grand Canal. Meanwhile, to the far west, there was a war that not many people actually know about. The Sikh Empire tried to invade Tibet. So the Chinese were forced to sign the Treaty of Nanking in 1842, and this allowed them to deal with the Sikh Empire. However, they had to hand Hong Kong over to the British and end the Canton system. But most importantly, they had to open themselves to the outside world. Outside of Hong Kong, the British were allowed to live in and trade in 5 other ports: Shanghai, Ningbo, Xiamen, Fuzhou, and Guangzhou. Other major nations began to follow suit in demanding trading ports be open, starting with the French and the Americans, and then, strangely, Norway, Sweden. Because of this, Christianity started making ground within China, and one of the early converts was Hongji Chuan. After failing the imperial examinations, he began to claim that he was the brother of Jesus, and in 1850 launched the Taiping Rebellion, one of the most deadly wars in human history, and a catalyst for further rebellions. So to recap, the Qing dynasty came to power in the middle of the 17th century, but quickly became corrupt and ineffective at governing over such a large population. As foreigners within their own country, the Manchurians faced opposition from the majority Han population, secret societies, conquered Muslim populations in the West, and many more. Upon entering the 19th century, a huge population boom mixed with a poor government led to widespread famines, and natural disasters would only make the problems worse. Yet, when people discuss the fall of the Qing dynasty, they often just cite the Opium Wars, fast forward a bit, and that's it. But going forward, you will see that half of the country was rebelling in the 1850s and 60s, and tens of millions would die. Millions more would die of further famines, floods, and the likes, and all of that would of course lead to the fall of the Qing dynasty. But I'll discuss that series of unfortunate events next episode. In 1842, the British forced the Chinese to open up 5 trading ports and allow the sale of opium. Other nations then followed suit and forced the Chinese to allow them to trade as well. And previously small towns became huge trading centers. Notably, Hong Kong and Shanghai thrived because of being opened up, and companies like Jardine Matheson grew incredibly wealthy off the opium trade. Plus, this is also the period in which HSBC, or the Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation, was founded. Otherwise, Christianity started to make ground within China, and one early convert was Hong Xichuan. After failing in the imperial examinations, he began to preach that he was the brother of Jesus, and in 1850 he launched the Taiping Rebellion, one of the most deadly wars in human history. But to state that it was merely born out of Hong's belief that he was the brother of Jesus would be a bit naive. Like I stated in the past episode, there were many problems facing the Qing dynasty. They had lost a great deal of money due to corruption, and their population had grown at a near unbearable rate, going from 100 million at the beginning of the 18th century to over 400 million in this period. Plus, like in the past, famines had once again played their part, and in the 1840s there were 2 major ones. In fact, famines in the early 19th century were reported to have killed over 40 million people. So, of course, the social order began to break down, especially further away from the coast, and many were hungry and angry with the lack of government response. Plus, Hong himself was an ethnic Hakka, which is a subdivision of the Han, and he gained a sizable following amongst his fellow Hakkas around Guangxi. As for the other ethnic groups in China at this time, I gave a brief rundown on them in the past video, so maybe go have a look at that. But this region in the south was filled with various ethnic groups like Cantonese and Zhuang, and there were always tensions between these communities. For instance, in 1831, there was a small Yao-led rebellion. Then there were also the secret societies like the Tiandi Hui, who looked to bring back the old ethnically Han Ming dynasty. But some also believed that there was a great cosmic shift coming, or in other words, the end of the world was nigh. This, which is called millenarianism, also encouraged many secret societies to launch further rebellions. So you had famines, ethnic tensions, and banditry, and Hong adapted Christianity to fit Chinese sensibilities. And then the rebellion broke out. But shortly after the Xianfeng Emperor came to power, the Yellow River flooded in 1851, once again drawing many angry Chinese people to join the Taiping Rebellion. So Hong was able to take Nanjing and set up the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, a Christian state in the heart of China, which almost overthrew the Qing dynasty. And to make things worse for the Qing, not only was he massacring Manchus, but people around the country followed suit and also launched their own rebellions. For instance, bandits in the north, no great purpose except stealing from the rich and aiding the poor, launched the Yan Rebellion in 1851. Their leader, Zhang Yixing, even claimed the mandate of heaven when they were in the advance, despite just previously being a salt smuggler. These rebels captured most of Shandong and southern Hebei, and caused a great deal of devastation for over 15 years. Then the Tiandi Hui came back into the picture, and a group closely connected to them, the Small Sword Society, captured Shanghai in 1851. Meanwhile, the Tiandi Guangdong started the Red Turban Rebellion in 1854. Although this was suppressed years later, it caused ethnic clashes between the Hakka, who held the imperial forces, and the Cantonese. In the end, this ethnic clan war, which lasted for around 10 years, killed close to 1 million people. Plus, to make matters a lot worse, there was an outbreak of plague, and this, the third plague pandemic, was quickly spread by refugees fleeing internal conflicts, and the horrors encouraged others to take up arms against the government. One region struck particularly badly was Yunnan, as there, in 1856, the Muslim Hui people rose up after Han Chinese massacred some of them. This began the Pantai Rebellion, which again lasted for years, this one until 1873, and claimed the lives of over 1 million people. Plus, later on, another Muslim rebellion, the Duncan Revolt, would break out in the far west. Otherwise, the ethnic Zhuang, led by Da Cheng in 1855, took over sections of Guangxi for around 10 years. Plus, the ethnic Mao took over sections of Guizhou for nearly 20 years. And in the midst of all of these rebellions, the Nepalese invaded Tibet in 1855, but this resulted in a stalemate. So most of China was up in arms at this point. Then, in 1856, the Chinese in Canton seized a ship known as the Arrow. As this ship was registered with British authorities, the Second Opium War erupted. The French joined the British, and so too did the Americans to a limited extent. And once again, the Chinese were easily beaten. Westerners in fact burned down the Summer Palace and forced the Chinese to sign another humiliating treaty, which included the expansion of Hong Kong and the payment of war reparations. Plus, as a bit of a side note, the man who ordered the destruction of the Summer Palace was James Bruce, the Earl of Elgin. His father, the previous Earl of Elgin, infamously transported the Greek Parthenon marbles back to Britain. So this father and son team caused quite a bit of cultural damage and hostility against the British for a very long time. However, the main benefactor of the Second Opium War was the Russians. They had already gained the right to trade in cities in western China, but now took the opportunity to begin moving troops into outer Manchuria. Then, threatening war on a second front, they forced the Qing dynasty to seize half of their ancestral homeland by 1860, allowing them to build the port of Vladivostok on the Pacific coast. Plus, the borders in the west were redrawn, with Russia taking the area around Lake Zhejiang, and the Russians would continue south through Central Asia, taking a lot of former Chinese tribute states away from Chinese influence. Shortly after this, the Shangfen Emperor died, and he left 8 regions to aid his young son, the Tongji Emperor, in dealing with the ongoing rebellion. But the former emperor had 2 empress dowagers, Sisi and Xian, and they united with his half-brother, Prince Gong, and launched a palace coup. This Xinyo coup not only put the empress dowager Sisi in a position of power, which would keep for the following decades, but through Prince Gong, China began to look to make some serious reforms. One of the first actions of this self-strengthening movement was the formation of mock armies. Although they had just been defeated by the British and French, they hired some Europeans to help train and modernize their army and navy. These included Frederick Townsend Ward, Leon Severny, and Charles George Gordon. Gordon, by the way, would later gain fame in Sudan, where he was killed by Mahdists when defending Khartoum. The first of these armies were the ever-victorious army, the Xiang Army, and the Peking Field Force. All of these included tens of thousands of men armed with Russian and French weapons while being trained by the British. The ever-victorious army, however, didn't last very long, as Gordon's strict discipline led to many soldiers deserting. The Xiang army would also later disband, but the Huai army emerged in its place, and it survived until the end of the century. Also, with foreign help, the Qing dynasty also set up the first modern shipyards in places like Jiangnan. So these reforms to the military during the self-strengthening movement succeeded in quelling the rebellions. But by now, after so many rebellions, the central government had essentially lost control over many of their provinces. And with this loss of control, banditry increased not only in China, but also in other nations as rebels fled the country. Many of these bandits and refugees fled to Vietnam and Laos, where they established their own armies like the Black Flag Army, captured land, and took over trade in the area. The Siamese led a number of unsuccessful campaigns against these Chinese bandits during the Boer Wars, while in Vietnam, they would actually come across the French. This is because the French had just taken over the south of Vietnam, but I'll get to this clash between Chinese bandits and the French in a little bit. Back in China, this self-strengthening movement occurred around the same time as the Meiji Restoration in Japan, but of course, both had very different results. The Japanese became a colonial power within just a few decades, whereas the Chinese continued to decline, and there's a few reasons as to why this was. Japanese modernization was greatly accelerated thanks to the Zaibatsu, 4 huge companies, Sumitomo, Mitsui, Mitsubishi, and Yasuda. A couple of these existed before the Meiji Restoration, showing that Japan did have the infrastructure in place to adopt capitalist reforms. Plus, they also had an early form of stock market in the Kyoto rice brokers. This, the Qing dynasty completely lacked. Plus, during the Meiji Restoration in Japan, the emperor's forces ousted the ruling shogun and his samurai allies. This removed the conservatives from power within the court and paved the way for reforms without any major opposition. In China, however, modernization came from the ruling emperor and only sought to maintain the status quo. The few reforms that were done somewhat reluctantly and disingenuously. For instance, sweeping economic reforms that would upset the status quo was met with a great deal of opposition. Plus, the 8-banner system, which I talked about in the past episode, was still influential. So, a nationalized modern army was again met with a lot of opposition. Furthermore, the new shipyards did produce a number of warships and were close to turning China into a regional maritime power, but they couldn't reorganize the structure of the navy, so the Beiyang, Nanyang, Guangdong, and Fujian shipyards all controlled the ships that they produced. This meant that during future wars, they essentially operated as four separate navies, rather than one very powerful navy. This was tested in the 1870s in Taiwan, but I think a little background on Taiwan is in order. Taiwan, otherwise known as Formosa in that time, had a large Aboriginal population, and in the 1860s, they attacked American sailors. The Americans responded by launching the Formosa expedition of 1867 against the attackers, but this had little in the way of real success. These Aboriginals then, in 1871, attacked sailors from Ryukyu, which was formerly independent, but coming under further Japanese influence. The Japanese demanded compensation on their behalf, but the Chinese argued that the Aboriginals were wild and outside their jurisdiction. So the Japanese launched their own expedition in 1874. The Japanese were then free to occupy sections of Qing territory, proving the fundamental weakness of the empire. Seeing this, the Japanese went ahead and just annexed Ryukyu a few years later, despite protests from the Chinese. And in the minds of the Japanese, it opened up the possibility of further expansion and colonization in the region. Plus, over in Korea, with Chinese power on the decline, they had lost their main protector. The Americans and French tried to open up the country in the 1860s, but despite a great loss of life, the Koreans refused to yield and open up. But they also still refused to acknowledge the leader of Japan as an emperor. So the Japanese, who were modernizing at a rapid pace, sent a ship to explore Korean waters, and it was fired upon. This resulted in the Gangwon Island incident in 1875, and the Koreans finally opened up. Some in Korea favored modernizing in line with the Japanese, yet the prevailing attitude was to still keep aligned with the Chinese. So Chinese soldiers were invited to remain in the country to train the new army and prevent falling under Japanese influence. Yet the structural problems that existed in the Chinese Navy also existed in the Chinese Army. Rather than being under a central command, the new armies were under the control of various high-ranking officials. For instance, in the case of the Huai Army, it was under the control of Li Hongjiang. So, once again, in future wars, they would often not unite to work together, and later on, the commanders would become warlords, and in next to no time, take over huge sections of the country in the early 20th century. Although Prince Gong lost favor in court after being accused of monopolizing state powers, Li Hongjiang would continue to push for reforms. Plus, another reformer was Zhou Dongtang. He helped establish the Fuzhou arsenal. Plus, he also led the expeditions west to crush the Dungan rebels and their leader Yaqub Beg. But Zhou strove to bring the West back under China's control, and won the debate against Li Hongjiang, who argued it was a useless territory. Zhou, by the way, is where General Zhou's chicken got its name. The Muslim rebels out in the west had established their own state, named Yetajan, and for a time they were recognized as a vassal of the Ottoman Empire, but largely only in name. However, Zhou's expeditions were successful and Yaqub Beg committed suicide, bringing Western China back into the fold. Now, during this rebellion, it's hard to estimate the number of people who were killed, but it could be as high as 20 million. A lot of these died due to famines caused by the war, but there were, of course, many massacres. Elsewhere, Shaanxi may have lost around 50% of their population, while Gansu lost closer to 75%. But despite all of this loss, China survived. The emperor at this time was Gangshu, but he took over in 1875 at just 4 years old. So real power was split between the likes of Li, Zhuo, and Empress Dowager Cixi and Xian. But Xian would die in the early 1880s, leaving Cixi with more power. Plus, around this time, Zhou advocated for a war with the Russians. They were, after all, in the midst of the Great Game with the British and had been expanding into Central Asia. So when Yaqub Beg had rebelled and pushed east, the Russians occupied parts of Yili. The moderates had court sent Zhong Ho to deal with the Russians and negotiate their peaceful withdrawal. But as Zhong Ho didn't know the geography of the area at all, he essentially handed the territory over to them in 1879. On his return, he was imprisoned as a traitor, and Zhou sent troops to the border, while Russian warships appeared off the coast. War was only avoided thanks to the signing of the Treaty of St. Petersburg. But this, the Ili crisis, shows that the Qing dynasty wasn't in a permanent state of weakness in the 19th century. They stood up to the Russians, and during 1880, over 200,000 rifles as well as artillery was shipped to China from Europe, and it became apparent they would not be a pushover on land at least. The Russians agreed to hand over territory because they were facing their own political upheaval and debt after their war with Turkey. But this whole crisis brought about mixed feelings in the West. Some British aided the Chinese during the crisis and believed an alliance with China would aid them against their Russian rivals. But others, in particular the Australians and Germans, began to fear the Yellow Peril. For instance, in Australia, a great deal of invasion literature was written in the following years. The Chinese public also became increasingly suspicious of the Westerners as well, especially because the Christians began to challenge their cultural practices. For instance, at this time, many Chinese still practiced foot binding, which the Westerners spoke out against. Plus, the widespread poverty caused by the rebellions, floods, and the likes meant many parents were turning to infanticide. Many Westerners spoke of how Chinese parents would drown their young girls in particular. But you could also find many abandoned children by the side of the road, or left in towers that were built specifically for that purpose. Some estimated that up to a third of all girls born in some region were killed shortly after birth. So the French missionaries set up the Association of the Holy Childhood to take in, baptize, and teach the abandoned children. This practice of infanticide would become a lot worse during the 1870s when a famine struck northern China. During this famine, it is estimated that around 10 million people died and conditions became desperate. There were also reports of husbands selling their wives, mass infanticide, and the likes. But as missionaries worked with the poor, rumors of them buying children and killing them began to circulate. So back in 1870, locals in Tianjin gathered and massacred 60 missionaries, priests, nuns, and converts. This wasn't the first anti-missionary riot. For instance, 2 years earlier in Yangzhou, similar rumors spread, claiming that British missionaries were making medicine out of the babies, and a riot broke out, spurred on by the local aristocracy. These rumors and anti-missionary riots would continue to grow over the decades and become more important. Eventually, in the late 19th century, anti-missionary activity would form the basis of the near partitioning of China, and later the Boxer Rebellion. Plus, the French in Asia had used the killing of their missionaries to invade southern Vietnam just years earlier. But the Chinese agreed to pay compensation and arrest the leaders of the riots, preventing any European intervention at this moment. Yet in Vietnam, the French continued to expand. In 1881, after a dispute between businessmen, the French captured the citadel in Hanoi and threatened to annex the entire nation. So the Vietnamese Emperor Tu Duc called on the Chinese bandits, the Black Flag Army, for assistance. China also sent troops south, and the French feared a large-scale war. So both agreed to split the country in two spheres of influence. But in 1883, Jules Ferry became Prime Minister of France, and after humiliation in the Franco-Prussian War, he hoped to rebuild his country through colonies. An expeditionary corps was sent to Asia to defeat the Black Flag Army and march against the Chinese, who still remained in Vietnam. The Chinese Guangxi army fled from the French at Bac Ninh, greatly embarrassing the Dowager Cixi and those who called for war against the French. But more than just their cowardice, there was another problem in the disjointed armies, as the Yunnan army did not come to the aid of the Guangxi army. So the commanders of both armies were either executed or committed suicide. So war supporters like Zhang Jidong had to step aside, and Li Hongjiang and his moderates made peace, agreeing to withdraw from Vietnam in 1884. Yet no date for withdrawal was set, and when the advancing French encountered the Chinese, they were ambushed, starting the Sino-French War. Along the border, the French really lacked the men to invade China, and their attacks were driven back. But at sea, the French were more successful. This is largely because the lack of central command hampered the Chinese war efforts. The French were free to sail and destroy dockyards in Fuzhou and the Fujian fleet. The other fleets, meanwhile, were reluctant to get involved and did little to help. The Guangdong fleet, for instance, made no attempts to break through the blockade. The Nanyang fleet split to protect their own cities, and the Beiyang fleet argued that the Japanese or Russians would exploit the situation. So the Fujian fleet was left alone and was nearly destroyed. Plus, the French moved to take Taiwan, blockaded rice shipments in the Yangtze River, and tried to secure an alliance with Japan. So the war could well have been completely disastrous for the Chinese, but false reports of a huge Chinese counterattack led to a political crisis in France and an early peace. Plus, as the Chinese removed their soldiers from Korea to fight the French, the Japanese aided Korean reformers in launching a coup. Chinese troops under Yuan Shikai were sent to restore order, but an all-out war wasn't desired by either side. So Li Hongshan once again looked to make peace. The Treaty of Tianjin was signed, and both Japan and China agreed to withdraw their troops from the country. However, in the court of China, Empress Dowager Cixi began to take over more control. In 1885, she downgraded Prince Gong to just an advisor and filled the Grand Council with easily manipulated people like Prince Chun. The Guangzhou Emperor would eventually come of age and take full power a few years later, but he made his first serious mistake in slowing down the growth of the Navy. Cixi had done a lot to try and modernize the Navy in particular, yet by 1889 this came to a standstill. Otherwise, for the most part, rebellions had subsided and there were no large-scale famines. But a peasant rebellion in Korea changed all that. This rebellion, the Donghak Rebellion, began as a result of high taxes and unpaid soldiers. The Chinese sent troops to help subdue it, but the Japanese argued that this was breaking their past treaties. Yet tensions had been escalating for some time, and Japan was already looking to expand. The German staff who had been employed to train the Chinese troops predicted that the Japanese would be crushed by the might of the Chinese. Yet this was not to be. This is because the pace of modernization in China had been slow, and only around 40% of soldiers in their army carried rifles. The rest of them brought things like old muskets, spears, swords, and even pikes into battle. Plus, there was very little in the way that could be described as modern tactics, and opium was also a particular problem in the ranks. To further exemplify this, there were allegedly soldiers who dressed as tigers while trying to intimidate the enemy with their ferocity. But the wife of a Western merchant, Mrs. Little, didn't believe that they existed at all. She said, "I was told that the tigers were not really soldiers at all, but that some officers treated them as if they existed. And then when the general came to inspect, all the beggars and riffraff of the city put on the tiger uniform over their rags. Turned out in so disorderly a condition that even the officers were afraid of them." So here, either way, you can see a great problem with China. Either this shows you that corruption was incredibly rife and they had no real armies to speak of, or they were still using a ludicrously outdated military unit. Plus, previously, to limit the number of people immigrating to Manchuria, railway lines were not constructed. This severely limited the amount of supplies that could be sent to Korea by land. So, as the Japanese began sending troops to fight the Chinese in Korea, they had to supply their own troops by sea, but the Japanese Navy defeated them at Pungdo. A greater defeat came at Yalu River, where the Beiyang fleet met a relatively equal Japanese fleet. But due to poor planning, lack of communication and the likes, they were crushed. Their German ships were taken by the Japanese, and for the next half a century or more, Japan gained dominance of the Sea in Asia, and China's decades of modernization were completely undone. Japan was then free to march into Manchuria, while they took Dalian, Weihai, and Taiwan. Meanwhile, further Muslim rebellions in the West broke out, and the Chinese had to create a new army to deal with that, the Kansu Braves. They were successful, yet some of their commanders belonged to the Mao family, and they would become powerful warlords in later decades who controlled the west of China in the early 20th century. So China was forced to make peace with the Japanese in 1895, and the Japanese were given control of Dalian and Taiwan. Yet the locals in Taiwan were unwilling to see the island fall into Japanese hands, so declared themselves to be a republic. The new president of Taiwan, Tang Jing-song, persuaded the leader of the Black Flag Bandit Army, Liu Yongfu, to serve in his army and resist the Japanese. But this was unsuccessful and the republic fell. Otherwise, Korea was now firmly under Japanese influence and would be later annexed by them. But the Japanese were unsuccessful in actually taking Dalian because of the Western powers, specifically the Russians. They wanted a warm water port in the east for themselves and feared Japanese encroachment. Meanwhile, the German Kaiser Wilhelm feared any sort of Asian power and is credited with coining the term Yellow Peril. So he united with the Russians, and the Russians united with their French allies, and together they pressured the Japanese into renouncing their claim on Dalian. As for the Chinese, they were severely humiliated. Japan had been seen as a lesser state for centuries, but now they had crushed them in a war, taken land and massacred many of their people. And after that war, there was a bit of a mad rush for concessions, and China seemed poised to be divided up like Africa was. However, for now, you can see that after the Opium Wars, The Chinese weren't necessarily doomed to suffer from a century of humiliation, as it's been called by later historians. They were able to threaten the Russians on land and hold back the French during the Sino-French War. And at some points, people even suspected that they would become the dominant power in Asia and not the Japanese. And it's not very hard to see why. They of course had the larger population and had created a larger navy. But institutional problems always meant they were on the losing end of wars, and as we enter the 20th century, anti-foreign sentiment led to further rebellions, lack of reforms led to further dissent, and a lack of central command led to the warlord period. But we'll look at the scramble for China, the dissolution of the Qing dynasty, and the warlord period in the next episode. In the 19th century, China was defeated by the British, endured a number of rebellions, suffered from famines and floods, and then were defeated by the Japanese. During it all, millions of people died, and the country became weaker and weaker. At the end of the First Sino-Japanese War in 1895, Japan took Taiwan, released Korea from Chinese influence, only to later annex it themselves. Plus, the Japanese were also set to take Port Arthur in Manchuria. But the Russians, Germans, and French intervened and forced them to hand Port Arthur back. But the Russians didn't do this out of kindness, they wanted it for themselves, and got support from their French ally, and pressuring Japan to hand it over. Meanwhile, Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany just sought to undermine the growth of an Asian power. And in fact, Wilhelm had been a little bit obsessed with the growth of any Asian nation, and is credited with coining the term Yellow Peril. So these three nations formed a triple intervention, and they were strong enough to force the Japanese to relinquish territory in 1895. And this ultimately humiliated them. This was especially bad as the Japanese then had to watch, as the Europeans began to claim Chinese territories. There was a rush for territory beginning in 1897, when, in Shandong, German missionaries were killed in the Juhi incident. The Germans had for a while had their eyes on Shandong, and just a year earlier, Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz had declared that it would be a good location for a future naval base. So the Germans quickly sent warships to the area and seized Kiachao Bay. They then forced the Chinese to lease the port for 99 years, and essentially all of Shandong fell into their sphere of influence, as they were given the right to build railway lines, mine for goods, and deploy troops of protection. This set off a chain reaction as foreign powers began to claim spheres of influence for themselves, similar in a way to the scramble for Africa, starting with Russia forcing China to hand over Port Arthur. Now China was forced into doing so because Russia had agreed to pay off the war indemnities to Japan as part of the Lee-Loganov Treaty. This was debt trap diplomacy, and this is something that China has been accused of doing in recent years. After the Russians, the French took Guangzhou, challenging British Hong Kong, while the British took Weihai to challenge the Germans and Russians in the north. Had things continued this way, it seemed that the Russians would be given a free hand in taking over Manchuria, Xinjiang, and the likes. Britain would set up a sphere of influence in the middle of China, France could expand in the south, and Germany would take Shandong. Plus, Japan had been eyeing up Fuzhou, forcing China to sign an agreement, preventing any other nation from putting it in their sphere of influence. And weirdly, even the Italians tried to claim San Mon Bay in 1899, but this was the only nation who the Chinese denied. Thankfully for China, however, one man in particular changed all of this. John Hay, the Secretary of State in the USA. He sent diplomatic notes to the European powers, encouraging them to uphold the open door policy and not to break up China. This open door policy, by the way, just made sure that all nations were free to trade in China equally. And it seems that most nations just agreed with it. For instance, shortly afterwards, Britain and Germany signed the Yangtze Agreement, agreeing not to divide China up into spheres of influence. Meanwhile, the scramble for colonies, along with the humiliation of the war with Japan, demonstrated that China had to do something to completely revolutionize their military, society, and even government. The Guangzhou Emperor in particular saw that reforms were needed to be made, and he launched the 100 Days Reform. This would have seen changes to everything, but the military reforms were particularly important. Even though in the past they continued to introduce new training techniques and modern weapons, there was no central command, so separate armies and navies wouldn't coordinate during a war. For instance, even in 1895, they created the new army, under the command of Yuan Shikai. But like past armies, their loyalty was to Yuan, not the country at large. So, of course, these reforms had a lot of opponents, like Yuan Shikai, who would have lost some degree of power. But there was also Prince Juan, who wanted to expel all foreigners, Ronglu, and the Empress Dowager Cixi. So to end the reforms, this group orchestrated a palace coup and placed the Guangzhou Emperor under house arrest. So now you had conservatives ruling China, and foreign powers claiming further concessions, building churches, and generally encroaching on Chinese land. Plus, many Chinese people were, of course, unaware of the secret agreements being made that would maintain China's open door policy. So, in Shandong, a new anti-foreign group emerged, the Fists of Harmony and Justice. Like secret organizations beforehand, like the Big Sword Society, they used martial arts to not only practice for war, but also entice people to join them. For instance, they would often demonstrate how they could survive gunshots, but it was probably more likely that there was not enough force in the shot to kill anyone. They also claimed to have magic powers, could even turn invisible at times, and cheat death. And under the leadership of Zhang Zicheng, they amassed a following of over 100,000 men. Plus, because of their martial arts background, they were given the title of boxers in the West. Initially, the boxers clashed with the Qing government forces at Senluo Temple in 1899. After all, they saw the Qing government as weak for allowing foreigners to enter China. But after this battle, they decided not to undermine the government, and they used the slogan, "Support the Qing, destroy the foreigners." In return for this, Sisi issued edicts defending them, and this allowed the boxers to spread out, killing Christians and burning churches on their way to Beijing. Over 400 foreign troops entered Beijing, but they were left trapped as the boxers cut the railway line to Tianjin in June 1900. Plus, Qing troops, notably the Muslim Gansu Braves, joined the boxers and both began attacking foreigners and burning churches in Beijing. The Gansu Braves, by the way, were created to deal with Muslim rebellions out of the West and were under the leadership of the powerful Ma family. But since coming to Beijing, they had helped in the palace coup and remained vehemently anti-foreign. Somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 men joined the boxers and laid siege to the foreign legation quarter, while 2,000 foreign troops landed in Tianjin. These troops came from 8 different nations: Britain, USA, Japan, Germany, Austria, France, Italy, and Russia. However, they had not asked permission to land, which upset the Qing dynasty, who now saw it as an invasion. So the Qing decided to fully align themselves with the Boxers. This new Boxer-Qing alliance was able to halt the foreign relief expedition at Langfang, and then the siege of the legation quarters officially began. The foreign legation quarters, by the way, were located right next to the Forbidden City, where the Empress Dowager lived. And only around 400 troops protected the 400 foreign civilians and the 3,000 Chinese Christians that lived there. Meanwhile, in the north, 100,000 Russian troops moved into Manchuria. They crushed the Boxers, who were harassing the construction of the Russian railway line in the region, and in Tianjin, 50,000 more troops from the 8 nations set out to Beijing, but without train lines as they had been destroyed, so they only made it to Beijing in mid-August. Once there, they crushed the Chinese, ending the 55-day-long siege, and the rebellion at large. The Empress Dowager by that point had already fled the city, and there was no desire to continue the war. The resulting peace treaty forced the Chinese to pay war reparations and give Western powers even more enclaves and concessions. In the north, Russia continued to occupy Manchuria, and this resulted in the outbreak of the Russo-Japanese War a couple years later. As the Empress Dowager was already gone, Li Hongzhang, the great military leader, reformer, and statesman, signed the Boxer Protocols in 1901, agreeing to pay a huge sum of money to foreigners just before he died. The United States, by the way, used their share of indemnities to create a university in Beijing, the Tsinghua University, which is often ranked one of the best universities in Asia today. After crushing the rebellion, foreigners were now largely allowed to roam across most of China, with some exceptions. For instance, in Tibet, they often banned missionaries and the likes. So the British launched an expedition there in 1903. But this expedition started without any authorization from London and was largely born out of a fear that Tibet was becoming more closely aligned to Russia. This was all part of the larger great game between the Russians and the British, and the British rulers in India were particularly worried. So they marched into Tibet and forced them to become a British protectorate. But at the end of this expedition, the government in London quickly handed it over to the Qing government. Now Tibet before this expedition was acting virtually independent. As the Qing government faced numerous rebellions and began to get weaker and weaker, the Dalai Lama had begun to assert more of his own authority. But following the expedition, the resulting treaties allowed missionaries to enter the region. So the Tibetan Lamas orchestrated a rebellion in 1905, massacring a number of French Catholics and converts. So the Qing sent in troops to subdue the rebellion, and Tibet was brought back into the fold, albeit very temporarily. Meanwhile, in Manchuria, Japan went to war against the Russians. They successfully drove the Russians out of Manchuria and took Port Arthur and southern Sakhalin. Eventually, the Japanese would begin to encroach into Manchuria themselves. But this Russo-Japanese war caused panic in China and even Europe and North America. Meanwhile, as for the Chinese government, Empress Dowager Sisi had already returned to power shortly after the rebellion. And on her return, she was more welcoming of foreigners, often inviting ambassadors and their wives to dinner. She also implemented the late Qing reforms and sent ambassadors abroad to learn from the great powers. Some of the reforms that she made included the abolition of the imperial examinations, but by now they were lagging far behind the Japanese. So Yuan Shikai, the leader of the new army, began to look to build alliances. Notably, he wanted to create an alliance with the German Kaiser and the United States. In fact, he very nearly succeeded in doing so, and put his political reputation on the line to secure it. However, the Americans under Teddy Roosevelt backed away from the alliance, and shortly afterwards, Sisi and the Guangzhou Emperor both died in 1908, and Yuan was removed from power. The Guangzhou Emperor was in fact poisoned, and it's believed Sisi killed him, knowing that she was about to die, as she was worried he'd try to bring back his radical reform attempts. Sisi therefore handpicked his successor just before dying. This was Pu Yi, the nephew of the Guangzhou Emperor. Although he